going to be talking about the importance of audio, obviously, as the title says, and I'm going to start by getting you to do a bit of an assignment. So just take a few moments to read the text on this screen. So that's good enough to give you a flavor for what's on there. Now I want to give you the podcast version of that same content.
This might be the first word you noticed as a child. Perhaps you heard the cheery song of an American robin coming from the top of a nearby tree. Or maybe you saw a robin running and pausing on the lawn, cocking its head before extracting a fat, juicy worm from the ground. Does the robin hear the worm or see the worm?
Now I'd like to do a bit of a quiz, and then I'll move on to actually doing the work myself. So show of hands, which of those was more engaging? Who felt more compelled by the text version? Maybe like one person in the back. And how about the audio version? So I was a little unsure what I would do if you didn't do what I expected, but you have. That's certainly the way I feel as well, and I think most audiences would feel that way, even if you swapped out these examples and put in others. There's something about the audio that pulls you in and gets you interested. And what I want to talk about today is why that is and how, and perhaps even why, we should harness that. And another way to think about this is the fact that there are elements of human nature that mean that we can harness this in order to get humans connecting with nature, and that's what I want to think about first. So I just want to start off by pointing out that basically we are hardwired to care about audio, and in particular, to care about the sound of the human voice. So we have a pretty decent range of frequencies over which we can hear, and it turns out that the range, you'll see it here in the red boxes, that we're most sensitive in is where you see the human voice. And in particular, our thresholds are best where we're discriminating between men and women and listening to other nuances in the way that we communicate with other humans. So we are built to pull this sound out of all the other sounds and to respond to it. And this is something that starts to happen, and here's a tiny little graphic showing that, around 4 to 7 months of age. You can wire up babies and see this beginning to happen. And we have these distinct regions in our brains that are not only listening for that human voice, but trying to figure out what's it saying and what does that mean to me. We also can find that narrative is quite important. And I should point out this is not just the type of narrative you hear, but narrative in general, including audio. And that, again, we have brain regions dedicated to this. We see activity and connectivity as a result of hearing narrative and stories. And then when you put this together, and when you compare this to the fact that we see these same sorts of things happening in other primates, this shows us that evolutionarily we are built, we are hardwired to care about this audio content, and we can take advantage of this adaptation. If you look at the social layer that you add on top of this, we know that voices are also very humanizing and relatable. We know that language is about 350,000 years old, written word only about 5,000, so intervening in all that time, how do we get across important information, histories, teaching, negotiating? It had to do with an oral tradition and sharing words. And if you look around the world, you can find that nearly ubiquitously across all cultures, we have this really important valuing of the human word. And you can see this in actions like having a preference for learning from stories rather than learning from data. And you can find that if someone tells you something, you actually will have a bit more value in that than if you read it somewhere. Now, as scientists, we might be a little bit different than the average person, but this is the trend that we do tend to see. Now, you'll notice I don't have any citations on this one. This one's purely from me, but I think that audio is quite important because you can have a soundtrack that helps you build the world to reinforce your message. So you've got this immersion and this emotional pull. Maybe it's because of stirring music, maybe it's because of sound effects or animals or ecosystem noises that helps a person think that they are there and relating to what you're talking about. But whatever it is, it does help them place themselves with your message and go along with it. And cumulatively, I think that all of these things really set us up to be able to use audio in a convincing way in the context of sharing science and convincing people to do things that we want them to do, like conservation. Now, podcasting is just one of many ways that you can think about using audio, but it's the one that I want to focus on today because lots of people are interested in it. These are data from the US, but you see similar patterns elsewhere, and this shows the amount of listenership of podcasts over time, since approximately when they started in the early 2000s. You can see this is a continuing positive trend. US data, UK data are the ones that we have the best numbers from, but elsewhere in the world you see growing podcasts as well. English, again, is the most common language, but again, other languages are starting to appear more as well. So there is this increasing pattern of interest in podcasts globally. These are data showing what happens with podcasts in the realm of science. And you can see that there's, again, this positive trend, but here towards the end it's actually more exponential than linear. Podcasts are continuing to be really exciting and of interest to people. And what's also intriguing is who is listening to podcasts and engaging with them. It's actually, this is not an even spread by any means, but there's quite a lot of people in all age groups that are listening to podcasts. No matter what your goal is, you've got your younger folks, you've got people, the ages here, you've got your retirees, so whoever you're targeting, you'll find them. We also do find that people are deliberately reaching out to different types of people in those demographics. So are they experts? Are they students? Are they just general lay audiences? And this is not just because people want to touch on these people and get them listening, but also because those are the folks who make up the market. That's where we see the activity. What's quite nice about them is that they're also really engaged. So very few people spend just a wee bit of time listening to podcasts. Those that engage listen predominantly for at least an hour and often several hours each week. And even if it is just an hour, that's a good amount of time to get your point across. I have less than that with the students that I see, and I'm theoretically teaching them. So hopefully that's a lot to work with. And if you look at which podcast topics are represented, I know this text is a bit small, but I can point out here biology, conservation, marine biology. These are all the sorts of disciplines that I imagine are here in the room today. Here up top we have general science. So the sorts of things that you guys are probably interested in, we do see those represented. And again, that's not just because people want to do those topics, but also because those are the topics that the consumer wants to hear. So many of the graphs on that following that previous slide were done by Lewis McKenzie, who put out a great paper earlier this year, and I suggest that you read it if you're interested in this topic. It's open access. So I contacted Lewis and said, if you were me standing here today, what would you want people to walk away with? And together we came up with a short list of points about what makes podcasting so great. Now the first two have to do with freedom. And that's both freedom for the listener and also freedom for the producer. This doesn't take a lot of equipment. It doesn't take a lot of time or money. You don't have to have an affiliation. You don't have to have an account. If you're a producer, you can do this rogue in your basement. If you're a listener, you don't even have to do iTunes if you don't want. So it's really adaptable and flexible, and you can completely personalize it to your own tastes. Another nice thing is that there's a lot of reach. So, of course, we're distributing podcasts online, and that means you can have a global audience. But also, because there are so many people, you can be as niche as you want and probably find someone who wants to listen. So you can go massive and try to get the huge general audience, or you can get really specific, and either way you can reach out and have that interaction with someone. And folks who listen to podcasts tend to like quite a lot of engagement and connectivity. And so they will like to talk with you and ask you questions and follow up. They want to talk to each other and have a community. And so this is a really nice way to get that sort of grassroots action that we want in conservation. You can build something and get people active around it. There's a lot of pedagogical value to podcasts. This is something that I research and use. And what's quite nice is that if you work with students, which I think many people here probably do, you can assign them podcasts as a task, and then you can disseminate those. It's quite an authentic assessment style. Or you can rest easy that in distributing podcasts, you yourself will be able to reach learners and teach them something. And finally, staying power. So Lewis pointed this out in respect of the curve that I showed earlier, where podcasts are increasingly common and increasingly popular. But I also think they're really important because they impact you, and it has an impact that lasts. So I have done a podcast for quite a long time, and I do little podcasts here and there. And I've noticed that doing that has changed how I associate with the content, where I look for content, what I view as being content, and certainly how I think about messaging and tell a story and look for a narrative. It has made me a better communicator in a different way than the other things that I do. So that's a really nice lasting effect as well. Now, what makes a great podcast? I think these are things that you could probably guess on your own, but taking advantage of all that human nature stuff I mentioned earlier. So make sure that you are creating that immersive experience with sound effects of whatever sort. Pay attention to the sound quality. You don't have to be a pro, but make sure there aren't pops and reverbs and things like that. Find a suitable style for you. Don't just feel that you have to mimic what your most popular and favorite podcast does. See what's good for your content, see what's good for your own personal interest, and find something that matches that. You don't actually have to tell a story, a literal story if you don't want, but make sure you include the elements of a good story. So things that really appeal to personal interest. You've got to have a hook, you've got to have human values, you've got to have interesting protagonists, and at the end, the moral of the story, and I think that's particularly important for conservation. And finally, I'd suggest going beyond the reporting. Take advantage of the fact that people who listen want to form communities. Have a web page where you have further links so that people who are pulled in by the sound of your voice will then go down the rabbit hole and learn lots more and do other things. Now, I think it's probably obvious, just to wrap up, why I think podcasting is so good for conservation. So I just want to end up with this picture here. A rousing and stirring speech as ever there was from Independence Day. And I think that this is quite cheesy, but it really does show that the power of the human voice can motivate you and get you interested and get you involved. And this is actually the sort of thing that podcasting can do. I get goosebumps every time I watch this scene, even though I know it's ludicrous. And you can do that with your own voice through a podcast and get people out there fighting for the environment and thinking about conservation. And that is a whiz through. There are so many more things I could say, but I'll be around afterwards to answer more questions if you want to chat.